4 years of war, millions dead. Then something worse arrived. The Spanish flu, the pandemic born in the trenches. A silent killer emerged from the chaos of World War I. It would kill more people than the entire war itself. Subscribe for untold stories from history's darkest moments. In the spring of 1918, as millions of soldiers faced each other across the scarred landscape of the Western Front, an invisible enemy began its assault. It started quietly in military camps, spreading through barracks and field hospitals with a speed that would eventually outpace the war itself. By autumn, this enemy would claim more lives than 4 years of mechanized warfare combined. Between 50 and 100 million people would die worldwide, yet this catastrophe emerged not from enemy artillery or poison gas, but from the very conditions of total war. The Spanish flu pandemic of 1918 represents one of history's most consequential medical crises, born directly from the crucible of the First World War. Trench conditions created the perfect breeding ground for disease. Malnutrition, crowding, and constant exposure weakened soldiers' bodies even as their spirits endured the horrors of combat. When influenza reached the port of Brest, France in April with American troops, it found an ideal vector for global transmission. Summer brought synchronized spread across continents via troop movements and merchant shipping. By October and November of 1918, mortality peaked simultaneously across 14 European nations. Yet the full story remained hidden. Wartime censorship suppressed casualty reports, allowing the plague to spread unchecked while governments maintained silence. Only neutral Spain reported honestly, inadvertently giving the pandemic its enduring name. This is the untold history of how war and disease converged to reshape the modern world. In the spring of 1918, the Western Front presented a landscape of unprecedented human concentration. Millions of soldiers occupied trenches that stretched from the English Channel to Switzerland, creating a dense network of military camps, training grounds, and staging areas across Europe and North America. These installations, designed to house fighting men, would become incubators for something far more indiscriminate than artillery or machine gun fire. The first documented cases of what would become the Spanish flu emerged in the United States military camps, particularly at Camp Funston in Kansas. There, in early 1918, soldiers began reporting to medical officers with complaints that seemed almost mundane compared to the horrors of modern warfare. Fever, cough, aching joints, headaches that throbbed behind the eyes. The symptoms appeared mild enough that most men returned to duty within days, their bodies seemingly having shaken off whatever minor infection had seized them. Medical staff recorded these cases with little alarm. Nothing in these presentations suggested the catastrophic mortality that would soon follow. What made Camp Funston and dozens of similar installations across America and Europe perfect breeding grounds for disease was the very nature of modern military organization. Soldiers lived in close quarters, often sharing bunkhouses with hundreds of others. Sanitation, while better than in previous centuries, remained inadequate for populations of such density. Men slept in rows, breathed the same air, ate from communal kitchens, and used shared latrines. The conditions of trench warfare itself had created a human environment unlike anything nature had previously encountered. Massive populations compressed into confined spaces, living in filth and privation, their immune systems already compromised by malnutrition and chronic stress. When soldiers traveled, they carried more than their rifles and kit bags. By April 1918, American troops arriving in Brest, France, brought the virus with them across the Atlantic. The great convoys of ships, packed with thousands of men in holds designed for cargo, became floating vectors of transmission. Once the infected soldiers disembarked in Europe, the disease found its way into the sprawling military infrastructure that supported the war effort. British military installations received it, French camps fell victim to it, German forces experienced it as well. No nation's army proved immune to its spread. The spring wave of 1918, as it would later be understood, remained relatively mild. Mortality rates were low. Healthy young men, the demographic that comprised most armies, recovered from infections within a few days. Some commanders barely registered the outbreak. Soldiers sick with influenza were replaced by others, and the machinery of war continued grinding forward with barely a pause. The virus seemed almost trivial compared to the daily slaughter of combat operations. Tens of thousands died in artillery barrages and machine gun attacks each month. A respiratory illness that killed a small fraction of those infected seemed almost inconsequential. Yet this first wave possessed historical significance beyond its immediate death toll. It was the moment when a virus of avian origin, now adapted to human transmission, began its global journey. The summer of 1918 saw the pandemic spread with the movement of military personnel and commercial shipping. Troops bound for the Western Front carried the virus. Supply ships traversed ocean routes. Soldiers granted leave traveled to distant ports. The interconnectedness of global warfare in the 20th century meant that a disease emerging in Kansas could reach the ports of Europe within weeks and the cities of Asia within months. The conditions that made military camps vulnerable to disease extended far beyond the camps themselves. Across Europe, the war had created unprecedented social disruption. Civilians worked in munitions factories alongside soldiers on leave. Refugees fled combat zones. Trains packed with troops and supplies crisscrossed continents. The normal boundaries between military and civilian populations had become increasingly permeable. Disease could flow through these channels as easily as military orders. The winter of 1917 to 1918 had been unusually harsh across Europe. Records indicate that unusually cold and wet conditions gripped the continent with heavy rainfall and freezing temperatures in the trenches themselves. Men suffered from trench foot, frostbite, and pneumonia. Their bodies were already weakened by exposure and malnutrition. Many soldiers in 1918 were consuming rations that provided barely sufficient calories for the physical demands placed upon them. Some units faced shortages of warm clothing and adequate shelter. The human immune system, stressed by these conditions, proved less capable of resisting infection. The wartime censorship that governed information flow in all the belligerent nations meant that the spring outbreak of influenza received minimal public attention. Military authorities in the United States, Britain, France, and Germany had no interest in publicizing disease outbreaks that might damage morale or suggest weakness to enemies. Information about illness rates was classified. Newspapers, subject to military censorship, printed little about the phenomenon. Medical journals circulated among professionals but reached limited audiences. The public, consumed with reports of battles and casualties, remained largely unaware that a new threat was establishing itself in the military populations of the world. Spain, as a neutral nation throughout the war, operated under different information constraints. Spanish newspapers reported on the influenza outbreak with less restriction than their counterparts in belligerent nations. When the disease later became widely known across Europe and the world, the name attached to it reflected this asymmetry of information. The Spanish flu became the common designation, not because the virus originated in Spain, it did not, but because Spain's press had reported on it more openly. This misnomer would persist throughout history, a linguistic artifact of wartime censorship. The spring of 1918 represented a threshold moment, though few recognized it as such at the time. Military medical officers documented cases in their records. Regimental surgeons treated sick soldiers. The virus continued its silent work of replication and transmission, moving from host to host, spreading through the dense human populations that modern warfare had created. The first wave passed through the military infrastructure of the world with relatively modest consequences. But the virus was not finished. It had gained a foothold in human populations. It had demonstrated that it could spread across continents and oceans. And most significantly, it had begun a process of mutation that would transform it from a mild illness into something far more sinister. The stage was set for what would unfold in the autumn months ahead. The summer of 1918 would see the pandemic spread globally, reaching every continent and major port city. But it was in those spring camps and troop transports, in the crowded barracks and contaminated air of military installations, that the true story of the Spanish flu began, not with a dramatic outbreak or immediate catastrophe, but with the quiet emergence of a virus that would kill more people than the war itself. The spring of 1918 brought not hope, but a terrible reckoning. While generals plotted their final offensives and politicians whispered of armistice negotiations, an invisible catastrophe was already in motion. The first wave of influenza that had emerged in the military camps of America and Europe in the preceding months seemed at first almost merciful compared to the horrors of trench warfare. Soldiers developed fevers, aches, and coughs, most recovered within days. Hospital orderlies noted cases with clinical detachment in their ledgers. No one yet understood they were witnessing the opening movement of a pandemic that would reshape the final months of the war and claim millions in its wake. By April 1918, American troops disembarking at Brest, France, carried more than weapons and resolve. They carried the influenza virus, spreading it through the port city and into the surrounding military infrastructure. The timing could not have been more catastrophic. The Western Front was preparing for the German spring offensive, launched that very month. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers were concentrated in preparation areas, moving through rail yards, crowding into transport ships, and assembling in staging zones. The The conditions that had made the trenches so lethal to disease were now replicated in rear areas with even greater intensity. Young men from across America, fresh from training camps where the virus had already taken hold, mingled with British, French, Canadian, and other allied forces. In the chaos of military logistics, no one was tracking the spread of influenza as a significant threat. The clinical presentations in these early months seemed almost unremarkable. A soldier would report to the medical officer with complaints of headache, muscle aches, and a dry cough. His temperature would spike, sometimes reaching 104 degrees Fahrenheit. Within a week, most men recovered and returned to duty. Army surgeons classified these cases as simple influenza, or grippe, as the French called it. They filed reports noting the cases but expressing no particular alarm. The disease seemed far less deadly than the bacterial pneumonias that sometimes followed respiratory infections. Military medicine in 1918 was already accustomed to managing disease on an enormous scale. What was one more fever among millions of soldiers? Yet beneath this apparent normalcy, something was changing. As summer 1918 arrived and the German spring offensive faltered against renewed Allied resistance, the virus was spreading through channels that wartime had uniquely opened. Troop movements across the Atlantic and within Europe accelerated the pandemic's reach. Ships carrying soldiers, supplies, and wounded men became floating vectors of transmission. Rail lines connecting military camps to the front lines became corridors of contagion. The concentrated populations of soldiers, already weakened by the psychological strain of war, malnutrition from restricted rations, and the cumulative toll of trench conditions, proved ideal hosts for the influenza virus to replicate and mutate. What scholars and epidemiologists would later debate was whether the spring wave of 1918 represented the true beginning of the pandemic or merely a prelude. Some evidence suggests that severe respiratory outbreaks in earlier years at the British military base at Étaples, France, in late 1916 and early 1917, and possibly in Austrian military records as early as 1917, may have been manifestations of the same virus or closely related strains. The clinical descriptions from Étaples medical records match the symptoms that would characterize the pandemic in 1918, but definitive genetic confirmation remains impossible, as no tissue samples from those earlier cases have been preserved. What is certain is that by summer 1918, the influenza virus had achieved global distribution through the mechanisms of modern warfare. The second wave arrived in the autumn of 1918, and with it came the true catastrophe. Where the spring wave had been merely troublesome, the fall wave was exceptionally lethal. The virus had apparently mutated into a far more virulent form, or the accumulated stress on soldiers' immune systems had reached a critical threshold. Beginning in September and reaching its terrible peak in October and November 1918, the pandemic killed with ferocious speed and efficiency. Medical records from military hospitals across Europe documented a shocking change in the disease's character. Men who had merely been fevered in the spring now developed severe respiratory distress within days of symptom onset. Their lungs filled with fluid, their skin took on a bluish tinge from lack of oxygen. Many died gasping for breath, their bodies unable to extract oxygen from air that seemed increasingly hostile to life. The mortality statistics that emerged from this period were staggering. In October and November 1918, mortality from influenza peaked simultaneously across 14 European nations, an epidemiological phenomenon that remains incompletely explained by historians and epidemiologists. The synchronization of death across continents, despite variations in climate, geography, and medical resources, suggests a virus of remarkable transmissibility and lethality. Military hospitals that had been designed to handle casualties from shell fire and gas attacks found themselves overwhelmed by patients whose wounds were invisible but no less fatal. Hospital wards filled with coughing, fevered men, orderlies worked until exhaustion forced them to collapse. Doctors, themselves infected, continued their rounds until they too became patients rather than physicians. The conditions that had created the pandemic's cradle in the trenches now accelerated its spread through the dying war. Soldiers weakened by years of trench warfare, malnutrition from restricted rations, sleep deprivation from constant vigilance, immune systems exhausted by exposure to cold, mud, and filth, had virtually no reserves left to fight a new enemy. The crowding that was endemic to military life became a death sentence. In barracks and transport ships, in field hospitals and rest camps, Men breathed the same contaminated air, shared the same water, touched the same surfaces. The virus spread through droplets and contact with an efficiency that overwhelmed every attempt at isolation or sanitation. The historical record from this period documents the strain on military medical services. Letters and reports from medical officers convey a sense of helplessness unprecedented even in the context of the war. One British Army surgeon wrote in his journal in November 1918 that he had lost count of the number of men he had watched die from influenza. He noted that in a single week his hospital had admitted over 300 cases and discharged fewer than 50. The rest remained hospitalized or had been transferred to other facilities. He expressed his bewilderment at the speed with which the disease progressed and his frustration at the complete absence of any effective treatment. Aspirin, quinine, and various other compounds were administered, but all with equal futility. The virus ran its course, and the patient either recovered or died. The social impact of the pandemic's second wave extended far beyond the military. As soldiers came on leave or were invalided home, they carried the virus with them into civilian populations. By October 1918, influenza was raging not only in military camps but in cities and towns across Europe, North America, and indeed the entire globe. Schools closed, theaters and gathering places were shut down. Public health authorities, where they existed and where they were not constrained by wartime censorship, began issuing guidance on hygiene and isolation. Yet in the warring nations, official acknowledgement of the pandemic's severity was muted or non-existent. Governments feared that admitting the scale of the catastrophe would damage morale at a critical moment in the war. This wartime censorship created a profound irony that shaped the pandemic's historical identity. While the Central Powers and the Western Allies suppressed news of influenza deaths, Spain, officially neutral in the war, had no such restrictions. Spanish newspapers reported freely on the influenza epidemic affecting their country. International observers, reading Spanish press accounts, began referring to the disease as the Spanish flu, a designation that was entirely misleading, as Spain was neither the origin nor uniquely affected by the pandemic. The virus had emerged in military camps, likely in Kansas or in the crowded training facilities of North America. It had been spread globally through the mechanisms of war. Spain's only distinction was that its government was honest about the catastrophe unfolding on its territory. By November 1918, as the German military collapsed and armistice negotiations reached their climax, the influenza pandemic had killed hundreds of thousands and sickened millions. Some historians argue that the pandemic weakened the Central Powers disproportionately, contributing to their military collapse and hastening the end of the war. German soldiers, already suffering from malnutrition and despair, fell to influenza in devastating numbers. Austrian soldiers, similarly weakened, succumbed in comparable proportions. The argument is plausible but contested. Others contend that the pandemic affected all belligerents more or less equally and should be understood as a catastrophe parallel to the war rather than a causal factor in its conclusion. What is indisputable is the timing and the scale. The armistice was signed on November 11, 1918, ending the fighting after 4 years of industrial slaughter. Yet the pandemic continued. As soldiers demobilized and returned to their homes, they carried influenza with them. Troop ships that had brought men to Europe now carried them home, spreading the virus across the Atlantic. Rail lines that had transported men to the front now transported them to their native cities. The third wave of the pandemic, arriving in winter 1918 and continuing into 1919 and 1920, would prove less immediately lethal than the second wave, but would extend the pandemic's reach into civilian populations in ways the earlier waves had not. The crisis of autumn 1918 represented the turning point not only in the military history of the First World War, but in the history of the pandemic itself. It was the moment when influenza transitioned from a military problem to a global catastrophe. It was the moment when the virus's true lethality revealed itself. It was the moment when the mechanisms of modern warfare, the concentration of millions of soldiers, the rapid transport across continents, the mingling of populations, became the perfect vector for a pandemic. And it was the moment when the world's governments, already exhausted by war, faced a new enemy that could not be defeated by military strategy or political negotiation. The human cost of this turning point was measured in millions of lives. Conservative estimates place the death toll from the influenza pandemic at 50 million people worldwide. though some scholars argue the true figure exceeded 100 million. The pandemic killed more people in a single year than the First World War had killed in 4 years. It killed soldiers and civilians, rich and poor, young and old. It killed doctors and nurses who tried to treat it. It killed entire families. It killed so many that in some places, mass graves were dug to accommodate the bodies faster than they could be individually buried. The pandemic transformed the final months of the war and the beginning of the peace that followed, leaving scars that would shape the 20th century. As autumn descended upon Europe in 1918, the pandemic entered its most devastating phase. The second wave, which had begun in late summer, reached its horrifying crescendo in October and November. Mortality peaked simultaneously across 14 European nations during this period, a synchronized surge of death that epidemiologists would struggle to explain for decades to come. The virus, having mutated during its global circulation, returned with unprecedented lethality. Where the spring wave had caused illness and disruption, the fall wave brought wholesale mortality. The statistics, when finally compiled, revealed a catastrophe that rivaled the war itself. In October 1918 alone, the pandemic killed more people in some nations than the entire conflict had in years of trench warfare. Military hospitals, already overwhelmed by combat casualties, now faced an impossible dual burden. Doctors and nurses who had learned to triage the wounded found themselves equally powerless against an enemy that could not be seen, could not be bandaged, could not be evacuated to safety. In the United States, the situation grew increasingly dire. Camp Devens in Massachusetts, one of the largest military installations in the nation, transformed into a necropolis. Hospital beds filled faster than they could be prepared. The camp's commandant reported that soldiers were dying so rapidly that the morgue could not accommodate the bodies. One physician, witnessing the cascade of deaths, wrote in despair, "We have been unable to check the epidemic. It has spread like wildfire." The spring outbreak at Camp Funston in Kansas, which had seemed so manageable in retrospect, now appeared to have been merely the opening movement of a symphony of death. Military units that had survived the Meuse-Argonne offensive, that had endured poison gas and artillery barrages, found themselves decimated by an invisible pathogen. Soldiers who had stood against machine gun fire collapsed in their bunks with fever and hemorrhaging lungs. The virus showed a peculiar predilection for the young and healthy, precisely those most likely to be serving in combat. This inverted the typical pattern of influenza, which usually killed the very young and the elderly. The pandemic appeared to weaponize the body's own immune response, causing cytokine storms that ravaged the lungs of vigorous young men. The military infrastructure that had spread the virus so effectively now became the means of tracking it. Medical records from camps across the American Expeditionary Forces painted a portrait of systematic collapse. In France, where American troops continued their operations even as the armistice negotiations proceeded, the infection spread through the armies with relentless efficiency. The concentration of humanity that had made the trenches such perfect incubators for disease now transformed entire divisions into plague vectors. Yet the war itself was ending. As November approached, the Central Powers crumbled under the combined weight of military exhaustion and social collapse. Some historians would later argue that the pandemic played a role in hastening the end of the conflict, that influenza contributed to the defeat of Germany and Austria-Hungary by weakening their already depleted populations and armies. The evidence remains contested, but the timing was undeniable. The armistice was signed on the 11th of November, 1918, ending the fighting that had claimed so many millions of lives. The guns fell silent, the trenches would be abandoned. Yet the influenza pandemic continued its work unabated. The third wave, beginning in winter and continuing into 1919, proved less lethal than its predecessor, but nonetheless significant in its toll. The virus had become endemic, circulating through the human population with the persistence of a chronic disease. Hospitals that had braced for the fall catastrophe now faced a grinding, sustained crisis. Medical personnel who had survived the autumn peak discovered that their ordeal was not ending but merely transforming into a different trial, one of exhaustion and sustained grief, rather than acute panic. Across Europe, the aftermath of war and pandemic created a landscape of profound trauma. Soldiers who returned home discovered that the enemy that had followed them across the Atlantic was still claiming victims among their families. Parents who had waited years for sons to return from the trenches buried them instead. The Spanish flu, as it became misnomered in the popular imagination, had become inextricably linked with the Great War itself in the minds of those who lived through both catastrophes. The name itself deserves examination. Spain, being neutral during the conflict, had not imposed the wartime censorship that gripped the belligerent nations. When influenza swept through Spanish cities in 1918, Spanish newspapers freely reported the cases and deaths. German, French, and British censors, by contrast, suppressed reports of the pandemic within their territories, fearing that news of widespread illness would demoralize troops and civilians already exhausted by years of conflict. The result was a tragic irony. The disease became associated with Spain not because it originated there, but because Spain was the only nation willing to acknowledge its presence. Neutral countries, and those not directly engaged in the fighting, reported more openly on the pandemic. The misnomer stuck, and to this day the pandemic is known as the Spanish flu, a name that obscured rather than illuminated its origins. The question of origin remained contested even as the pandemic faded. The most widely accepted theory traced the first cases to Camp Funston in Kansas in the spring of 1918, where the virus had likely jumped from avian or swine reservoirs to human populations. Yet other researchers pointed to earlier outbreaks. Some evidence suggested that a severe respiratory illness had struck the British military base at Étaples in France during late 1916 and early 1917, with clinical descriptions that matched the later pandemic. Other scholars examined Austrian archives and detected unusual morbidity patterns in Austria in early 1917. The virus's true origin would remain shrouded in the fog of war and time, debated by epidemiologists and historians for a century to come. What was certain was that the conditions of the war had created the perfect storm for pandemic spread. The trenches had been incubators of disease long before influenza arrived. The combination of malnutrition, exhaustion, exposure to cold and wet, and the complete impossibility of sanitation in the front lines had left soldiers in a state of immunological compromise. When the virus arrived, it found populations primed for catastrophic infection. The overcrowded ships that transported American troops to Europe had functioned as floating petri dishes, concentrating the virus and spreading it across the Atlantic with horrifying efficiency. The military camps themselves, designed for mobilization rather than health, had transformed into transmission centers of lethal efficiency. The medical response, hampered by the state of knowledge in 1918, proved largely ineffective. Doctors understood neither the viral nature of the disease nor the mechanisms of its transmission. Treatments were symptomatic at best, often counterproductive. The use of aspirin, administered in massive doses, may have actually worsened outcomes by increasing the risk of secondary bacterial pneumonia. Quarantine measures, when implemented, came too late and were too inconsistently applied to slow the pandemic's spread. The influenza virus, unknown and unnamed in the medical literature of the time, ravaged populations while physicians could only watch and document the disaster. The casualty figures, when finally compiled in the years following 1918, shocked the world. The pandemic had killed between 50 and 100 million people globally, a range reflecting both the impossibility of accurate counting in many regions and the genuine uncertainty about how many deaths to attribute to influenza versus its secondary complications. In some nations, the pandemic killed more people than the entire war had. In others, the deaths were less dramatic in absolute numbers, but no less devastating in their social impact. Entire families were wiped out. Communities lost multiple generations in rapid succession. The psychological weight of this invisible death added to the trauma of war. The social aftermath proved as significant as the mortality itself. Survivors emerged from the pandemic changed, bearing psychological scars alongside their physical recovery. The experience of watching loved ones die rapidly from a disease that seemed to strike randomly, that offered no heroism or meaning, that could not be fought or resisted, this created a particular kind of trauma distinct from war-related grief. Soldiers who had endured the trenches found themselves grieving not only fallen comrades but also parents, siblings, and spouses claimed by the flu. The collective experience of pandemic and war created a generation marked by unprecedented loss. In the years that followed, society struggled to process these dual catastrophes. Memorials were erected to war dead, but the pandemic victims were often forgotten or subsumed into the general trauma of the period. Historians initially overlooked the influenza pandemic, focusing their attention on the political and military dimensions of the war. It was not until the late 20th century, with the rise of social history and the approach of the pandemic's centennial, that scholars began to examine how deeply influenza had shaped the post-war world. The pandemic's legacy proved multifaceted. It accelerated the development of epidemiology as a scientific discipline, prompting researchers to develop new methods for tracking disease spread and understanding viral transmission. The experience of 1918 would inform public health responses to subsequent pandemics. Though the lessons were not always well retained, it contributed to the emergence of social medicine and greater attention to the relationship between poverty, malnutrition, and disease susceptibility. The pandemic demonstrated that modern warfare created conditions uniquely favorable to epidemic disease, a realization that would shape military planning and public health policy throughout the 20th century. The virus itself, preserved in the tissues of victims buried in permafrost and carefully maintained in laboratory samples, would eventually be sequenced by scientists in the late 1990s. The genetic analysis confirmed that the 1918 pandemic was caused by an H1N1 influenza virus, likely descended from an avian ancestor. The virus's genetic structure revealed why it had been so lethal. It possessed mutations that increased virulence and transmissibility while triggering an excessive immune response in healthy young adults. The science of 100 years later could explain what the medicine of 1918 could not. By 1920, the pandemic was fading. The third wave had run its course. The virus had either killed or immunized most of the human population it encountered. Those who survived, and there were hundreds of millions of them, carried immunity in their blood. The influenza that had seemed like a plague of biblical proportions gradually became endemic, incorporated into the seasonal pattern of respiratory illness that would persist into the modern era. Subsequent strains of influenza would emerge, some descended from the 1918 virus, others arising from new recombinations and mutations, but none would match the catastrophic mortality of that terrible pandemic. The Western Front, where the pandemic had found its first great concentration of victims, was gradually transformed. The trenches were filled in, the barbed wire removed, the bodies exhumed for proper burial. The landscape of northeastern France and Belgium began to heal, though it would bear scars for generations. Cemeteries multiplied across the region, filled with soldiers from dozens of nations. Among those graves lay men who had died not from bullets or gas, but from influenza, their sacrifice unsung and often uncounted in the official tallies of war dead. The connection between war and pandemic became clearer in retrospect. The mobilization of millions of soldiers, their concentration in camps and ships, their movement across continents, the destruction of civilian infrastructure and health systems, all of these had created conditions perfectly suited to the emergence and spread of a novel pathogen. The Great War had not merely been a military catastrophe, it had been an epidemiological catastrophe as well. The two disasters had intertwined, each amplifying the other's impact. In the decades that followed, military planners would remember this lesson. Subsequent wars would incorporate disease prevention and epidemic control into their planning. The experience of 1918 would inform the response to influenza outbreaks in 1957 and 1968. And would echo forward into the 21st century responses to novel pandemics. The Spanish flu had taught humanity a bitter lesson about the vulnerability of concentrated populations and the way that modern war created conditions for modern plagues. As the 20th century progressed and then gave way to the 21st, the pandemic of 1918 gradually faded from popular memory. Survivors died, carrying their memories with them. The historical record became the primary repository of knowledge about what had occurred. Only when the centennial approached, 100 years after 1918, did widespread attention return to the pandemic. Historians, epidemiologists, and public health officials began to examine the event with renewed urgency, conscious that the lessons of that era remained relevant to contemporary challenges. The Spanish flu represented a hinge point in human history, the moment when modern warfare and modern disease intersected with catastrophic results. It demonstrated that the greatest threats to human survival did not always come from the weapons and strategies of war, but from the conditions that war created. The trenches of the Western Front had incubated not only soldiers, but also a pathogen that would ultimately kill far more people than the war itself. The legacy of 1918 was a world transformed by dual catastrophe, militarized and epidemiologically aware in new ways, forever changed by the experience of plague and war intertwined. Thanks so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed learning about this pivotal moment in history. If you found this video interesting, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss our next World War I story. I'd love to hear what you think. Drop a comment down below and let me know your thoughts or share any questions you have. Your feedback really means the world to me. We've got so many more incredible stories from the Great War coming your way soon, so make sure you're subscribed to stay in the loop. Thanks again for being here. Stay curious and keep learning. See you next time.